The native woman begged the lonely cowboy, "Can you act as my husband for 1 week?" The winter of 1889 came down hard on Montana, bringing with it winds so cold they could freeze a man's breath before it left his lips. Snow blanketed the rough terrain, turning the vast landscape into an endless white desert. Through this harsh wilderness rode Jack Morrison, a cowboy whose eyes had seen too much sorrow for a man of only 35 years. Jack sat tall in his saddle despite the weariness that had settled deep in his bones. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Daisy, picked her way carefully through the snow-covered trail. Jack's coat was worn at the edges, and his hat had seen better days, but he wore them with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to make do with what he had. 3 years had passed since he buried his wife Sarah, and in those 3 years he had become a wanderer. He moved from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to put down roots, never allowing himself to get close to anyone. The pain of loss had taught him that caring for people only led to heartbreak. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, Jack spotted the small town of Cedar Ridge in the distance. Smoke rose from chimneys, promising warmth and perhaps a hot meal. His stomach growled at the thought. He had been riding for 2 days, surviving on dried meat and stale bread. The town was small, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a single main street, but to Jack it looked like paradise. He guided Daisy toward the livery stable, where an older man with a thick gray beard greeted him with a nod. Jack paid for Daisy's care and shouldered his worn saddlebag, making his way down the street. His boots crunched in the snow as he walked past the saloon, the church, and a small schoolhouse. His destination was the general store, where he hoped to buy supplies and maybe hear about work opportunities in the area. The general store was warm and smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and the sharp scent of pickle barrels. A pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated heat, and Jack felt his frozen fingers begin to tingle as blood flowed back into them. The storekeeper, a friendly man with round spectacles, helped him gather flour, coffee, beans, and tobacco. As Jack counted out his coins, the bell above the door chimed, announcing another customer. Jack glanced up and saw a woman enter with a young girl holding her hand. The woman was Native American, her long black hair braided down her back, her face striking with high cheekbones and dark, intelligent eyes. She wore a simple dress made of blue calico with intricate beadwork at the collar, clearly her own handiwork. The little girl beside her, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, had the same dark eyes and wore her hair in 2 neat braids. They moved quietly through the store, the woman selecting items carefully while keeping a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. Jack noticed how the storekeeper's friendly demeanor changed slightly, becoming more formal and reserved. He noticed how another customer, an older white woman, shifted away from them with a disapproving sniff. Jack had seen this kind of treatment before, and it always left a bitter taste in his mouth. He finished his transaction and was heading toward the door when he heard a soft voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Jack turned to find the native woman standing a few feet away, her daughter partially hidden behind her skirts. Up close he could see the fine lines of worry around her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small drawstring purse. "Yes, ma'am," Jack responded, removing his hat out of respect. The woman glanced around nervously as if checking to see who might be watching. The storekeeper was busy with another customer and the store had emptied somewhat. She took a small step closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My name is Ayana. I have been watching you since you entered, and I believe you are a good man. I can see it in your eyes." She paused, swallowing hard. "I need to ask you something. Something very unusual. Please, will you hear me out?" Jack felt a prickle of curiosity mixed with caution. He had learned to be wary of strangers with requests, but something about this woman's desperation touched him. He nodded slowly. "I'll listen." Ayana's relief was visible. She glanced down at her daughter and spoke softly in what Jack assumed was the Crow language. The little girl nodded and moved to look at some colorful ribbons on a nearby counter, though she kept glancing back at her mother anxiously. "I live here in Cedar Ridge with my daughter, Little Bird," Ayana began, her English accented but clear. "3 years ago, my husband David died. He was a white man, a good man who worked as a translator and helped keep peace between my people and the settlers. When he died, he left us this small cabin and a little money. I work as a seamstress and I gather herbs for the doctor. We manage well enough." She paused, her fingers twisting the strings of her purse. Jack waited patiently, sensing there was much more to come. "David's family back east never approved of our marriage," she continued, her voice growing tighter. "His brother Thomas and his wife Margaret thought he was foolish to marry a Crow woman. They came to the wedding but left angry. For 3 years they have left us alone. But last week I received a letter." She pulled a creased envelope from her pocket. They are coming to visit. They will arrive in 1 week. But this is not a friendly visit. Thomas writes that he is concerned about Little Bird's upbringing. He says a widow, especially an Indian widow, cannot properly care for a child alone. He says Little Bird should come live with them in Boston, where she can have proper schooling and proper opportunities. Jack's jaw tightened. He had seen enough injustice in his travels to understand exactly what was happening here. They want to take your daughter. Ayana's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Yes, the law would likely side with them. I am native. They are white and wealthy. It can provide things I cannot. A judge would listen to them, not to me. Even though Little Bird is happy, even though I love her and care for her well, it would not matter. Her voice broke slightly. She is all I have left of David. She is my whole world. The little girl had stopped looking at ribbons and was watching her mother with worried eyes. Jack felt a tightness in his chest. He thought of his own Sarah, of the children they had hoped to have but never did before illness took her away. He thought of the emptiness that had filled his days since. "What is it you need from me?" he asked quietly, though he was beginning to suspect he knew. Ayana took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I need you to pretend to be my husband. Just for 1 week. If Thomas and Margaret see that I have remarried, that Little Bird has a father figure, a provider, they might leave us alone. They might see that we are a proper family." The words came out in a rush, as if she feared she would lose her nerve if she spoke slowly. "I know this is a strange request. I know I have no right to ask this of a stranger, but I watched you in here. You treated the storekeeper with respect. You tipped your hat to me even though others would not. You did not look at me with hatred or disgust. I am begging you, please. Help me keep my daughter." Jack stood silent for a long moment, his mind racing. This was perhaps the strangest request anyone had ever made of him. To pretend to be someone's husband? To lie to people he had never met? It went against his nature. He was a man who valued honesty, who had always tried to walk a straight path despite the hardships life had thrown at him. But then he looked at Little Bird, who was now standing close to her mother, her small hand gripping Ayana's skirt. He saw the fear in those young eyes, the fear of being torn from the only parent she had ever known. He thought about the prejudice he had witnessed, the way the law favored the powerful over the just. He thought about how, if circumstances had been different, he might have had a daughter like Little Bird, and how he would have moved heaven and earth to protect her. 1 week? He asked finally. Ayana nodded eagerly. They arrive in 7 days. They plan to stay for 1 week to observe our situation. That is all I ask. 7 days of pretending, and then you can go on your way. I can pay you a little, not much, but something for your trouble. Jack shook his head. I don't want your money. He saw her face fall and quickly added, but I'll help you. Not for money, because it's the right thing to do, because no mother should have her child taken away when she's done nothing wrong. The relief that washed over Ayana's face was so profound that for a moment Jack thought she might collapse. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears did spill over then, running down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you. You do not know what this means." Little Bird looked up at Jack with those solemn dark eyes, and he felt something shift in his chest, some small crack in the wall he had built around his heart. "When do we start?" he asked, suddenly very aware that he had just agreed to something that would change everything, though he did not yet know how much. The next morning arrived cold and clear, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows of Ayana's small cabin. Jack had spent the previous night at the local boarding house, but now he stood outside her home with his saddlebag slung over his shoulder, feeling more nervous than he had felt in years. He raised his hand and knocked gently on the wooden door. Ayana opened it almost immediately, as if she had been waiting just on the other side. She wore a different dress today, this one a deep green color with the same beautiful beadwork along the sleeves. Her eyes showed that she had not slept much, but there was determination in her expression. Little Bird peeked out from behind her mother, curious but still cautious around this stranger who was about to become part of their lives. "Come in, please," Ayana said, stepping aside to let Jack enter. "We have much to discuss and prepare." Jack stepped into the cabin and was immediately struck by how warm and welcoming it felt. The single room was small but meticulously clean. A large bed stood in one corner, clearly where Ayana and Little Bird slept together. There was a simple kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and colorful woven blankets hung on the walls to provide both decoration and insulation against the cold. Herbs hung drying from the ceiling beams, filling the air with the scent of sage and sweetgrass. Jack noticed the careful arrangement of everything, the way Ayana had made a real home despite having so little. "You have a nice place here," Jack said sincerely, setting his bag down near the door. Ayanna smiled slightly, the first real smile he had seen from her. "Thank you. David built this cabin with his own hands. It is small, but it holds all our memories." She moved to the stove where coffee was brewing. "Please, sit. We have work to do." Jack settled into one of the chairs at the table while Little Bird climbed onto the other one, still watching him with those serious eyes. Ayanna poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one before Jack, then gave Little Bird a cup of milk. She sat down with a notebook and a pencil, opening it to reveal pages covered in neat handwriting. "I stayed up last night writing down everything you need to know about David and about our life together," she explained. "Thomas and Margaret will ask questions. They will try to find holes in our story. We must be prepared." Over the next hour, Ayanna told Jack about her late husband. David Whitmore had been a schoolteacher who came west with idealistic dreams of helping bridge the gap between white settlers and native peoples. He learned the Crow language, lived among Ayanna's people, and eventually fell in love with her. They married against his family's wishes in a ceremony that honored both cultures. David had been kind and gentle, a man who believed in justice and equality even when those around him did not. He died trying to stop a fight between a crow hunter and a white rancher who accused him of stealing cattle, Ayanna said quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. He stepped between them to talk, to calm things down. But the rancher's gun went off. David did not even get to say goodbye. He was gone before the doctor could arrive. Jack saw the pain in her eyes and understood it deeply. He had held his own wife as she slipped away, watching helplessly as fever consumed her. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Ayanna agreed. "The best man I ever knew. Until now I thought I would never trust another man again." She looked up at Jack. "But you are here, helping a stranger for no reason except kindness." "David would have liked you." Little Bird, who had been listening quietly while drinking her milk, suddenly spoke up in a small voice. "Are you really going to be my papa?" Jack felt his throat tighten. He looked at the little girl with her hopeful, scared face and chose his words carefully. "I'm going to pretend to be your papa for a little while so that your real papa's brother doesn't take you away from your mama. Can you help me with that?" Little Bird nodded solemnly. "I can pretend. Mama says pretending is like the story she tells me at night. We make believe something is real even though we know the truth." "That's exactly right," Jack said, impressed by the child's understanding. "You're a smart girl." For the first time, Little Bird smiled at him, and Jack felt that crack in his heart widen just a little more. The days that followed were strange and intense. Jack moved his few belongings into the cabin, sleeping on blankets laid out on the floor near the stove. Every morning, Ayanna would quiz him on details about their supposed marriage. When did they marry? 6 months ago, they decided in a quiet ceremony with just the local preacher and a few witnesses. How did they meet? Jack had come to town looking for work, and Ayanna had mended his torn coat. They had talked, found comfort in their shared grief as fellow widowed people, and gradually fell in love. Ayanna taught Jack about her late husband's family. Thomas Whitmore was a banker in Boston, serious and stern, a man who believed in rules and proper behavior. He had never understood why his younger brother had thrown away opportunities back east to come west and live among Indians. Margaret, his wife, came from old money and had very fixed ideas about how people should live. She had 3 daughters of her own, all married to respectable men, and she believed Little Bird would be better off in their civilized world than in what she saw as primitive conditions. "They think they are doing the right thing," Ayanna explained as she cooked dinner one evening. Jack sat at the table cleaning his rifle while Little Bird played with a cornhusk doll. In their minds, they are rescuing Little Bird from a hard life. They cannot see that she is already loved and cared for. "They only see that I am crow and poor. Then we'll show them different," Jack said firmly. "We'll show them a home full of love. That's what matters most." As the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. The pretending started to feel less like pretending. Jack found himself naturally falling into the rhythms of family life. He would wake early and start the fire in the stove so the cabin was warm when Ayanna and Little Bird got up. He split wood for the winter and repaired the loose step on the cabin's small porch. He went to the general store for supplies, and word quickly spread through town that the widow Ayanna had remarried. Some people looked surprised, others disapproving, but a few, like the kind storekeeper, seemed genuinely happy for her. Little Bird gradually lost her shyness around Jack. She started talking to him more, asking him questions about his life and his travels. He told her stories about his days as a cowboy, about wild horses and cattle drives, about sleeping under stars so bright they looked like diamonds scattered across black velvet. She listened with wide eyes, sometimes laughing at the funny parts, sometimes asking for more details. One afternoon, Jack was outside chopping wood when Little Bird came running up to him, excitement written all over her face. "Jack! Jack! Come see what Mama's making." She grabbed his gloved hand and pulled him toward the cabin. Inside, Ayanna stood at the table with fabric spread out before her. She looked up when they entered, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "I'm making you a new shirt," she explained. "The one you wear is very worn. If Thomas and Margaret see you in clothes with holes, they will think we are poor and struggling. We must look like we are doing well." Jack felt touched by her thoughtfulness. "You don't have to do that. I can make do." "I want to," Ayanna insisted. "Besides, I am a seamstress." "It is what I do." She held up the dark blue fabric. This was David's. "I have been saving it, not able to bear using it, but I think now is the time. He would want you to have it, for helping us." Jack swallowed hard, honored by the gesture. "Thank you. That means a lot." Over dinner that evening, Ayanna quizzed him again, but this time it felt more like conversation than interrogation. They talked about what they would say if Thomas asked about their finances. Jack had some money saved from his ranch work, and Ayanna had her sewing income plus the small amount David had left. Together they could present themselves as modest but stable. "What if he asks about our sleeping arrangements?" Jack asked, then felt his face heat up at the awkwardness of the question. Ayanna had clearly thought about this. "We will say that Little Bird sleeps in the bed with me, and you sleep on the floor because the bed is too small for three. Many families have such arrangements when space is limited." "It is not unusual," Little Bird, who was supposed to be eating her stew, piped up unexpectedly. "But when are you and Jack going to kiss?" Both adults froze. Ayanna's eyes went wide, and Jack nearly choked on his coffee. "Why would you ask that, little one?" Ayanna asked carefully. Little Bird looked between them with innocent confusion. "Because that's what married people do. Mary at school says her mama and papa kiss all the time. If Uncle Thomas comes and you and Jack never kiss, he will know you are not really married." The child had a point, and both Jack and Ayanna knew it. They looked at each other across the table, and for a long moment neither spoke. The cabin suddenly felt very warm despite the cold outside. Finally Jack cleared his throat. "The girl's right. If we're going to convince your brother-in-law, we need to at least look comfortable with each other, like a real married couple would be." Ayanna nodded slowly, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Yes, you are right. We should practice, just so it looks natural." The awkwardness hung in the air like smoke. Little Bird, satisfied that the adults understood the problem, went back to eating her stew, completely unaware of the tension she had created. Later that night, after Little Bird had fallen asleep in the big bed, Jack and Ayanna sat by the stove, both pretending to be very interested in their coffee. Finally, Ayanna stood up, smoothing her skirt nervously. "We should do this now," she said quietly. "Get it over with so it is not so strange." Jack stood as well, his heart beating faster than it had any right to. He stepped closer to Ayanna, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to smell the sage and sweetgrass that seemed to cling to her hair. She looked up at him, and he could see she was nervous too. "It's just for practice," he said softly. "Just so we know we can do it if we need to." "Yes," she whispered. "Just practice." Jack gently placed his hand on her cheek, feeling how soft her skin was. Ayanna's breath caught slightly, but she didn't pull away. Slowly, carefully, Jack leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in the briefest, gentlest kiss. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to change something between them, to make them both realize that this arrangement was becoming more complicated than either had expected. When they pulled apart, both stood in silence for a long moment. Then Ayanna stepped back, her hand moving to touch her lips briefly before dropping to her side. "That was good," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," Jack agreed, his own voice rough. "Believable." They both knew they were lying, but neither was ready to admit what they were really feeling. Instead, they said goodnight and retreated to their separate sleeping areas, both lying awake for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside and wondering what they had gotten themselves into. The next morning brought news that made everything suddenly more real. A telegram arrived at the general store addressed to Ayanna. Thomas and Margaret Whitmore would be arriving in 3 days, 2 days earlier than expected. The time for preparation was running out, and soon Jack and Ayanna would have to face the biggest performance of their lives. The news of the Whitmores' early arrival sent a wave of panic through the small cabin. Ayanna's hands trembled as she held the telegram, reading it over and over as if the words might change. Jack stood beside her, feeling his own stomach tighten with worry. They had lost 2 precious days of preparation, and now the moment of truth was rushing towards them like a runaway horse. "We can do this," Jack said, placing a reassuring hand on Ayana's shoulder. "We've practiced enough. We know our story. We just have to stay calm and stay together." Ayana nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "You are right. We must be strong. For little bird." She looked over at her daughter, who was sitting on the bed, sensing the tension in the room, even if she did not fully understand it. "Come here, little one. We need to talk." Little bird climbed down from the bed and came to stand between her mother and Jack. Ayana knelt down to be at eye level with her daughter, taking both of the child's small hands in her own. "The people I told you about, your Papa David's brother and his wife, they are coming sooner than we thought. They will be here in 3 days. Remember what we talked about? You need to call Jack your papa when they are here. Can you do that?" Little bird looked up at Jack with those serious dark eyes, then back at her mother. "Will they really take me away if I make a mistake?" The fear in her voice broke Jack's heart. He knelt down beside Ayuna so he could look little bird in the eyes. "Listen to me. Your mama and I are going to do everything we can to make sure you stay right here where you belong. But yes, we all need to be very careful. These people, they think they know what is best, but they do not understand how much your mama loves you." Little bird thought about this for a moment, then wrapped her arms around Jack's neck in a sudden tight hug. "I will be good, I promise. I will call you Papa, and I will not make mistakes." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion as he hugged the little girl back. Over her shoulder, he saw tears glistening in Ayana's eyes. What had started as a simple arrangement to help a stranger was becoming something much deeper, much more real. Jack was starting to care about these 2 people in a way he had not allowed himself to care about anyone since Sarah died. The next 3 days were a blur of frantic activity. Ayana cleaned the cabin until it sparkled, washing every surface, beating the rugs, polishing the few pieces of furniture they owned. Jack repaired everything that needed fixing, making sure the cabin looked well maintained. He also made sure there were plenty of supplies, buying extra food and wood so the Whitmores would see they had enough to live comfortably. Ayana finished the new shirt she had been making for Jack. When he put it on, she stepped back to look at him with a critical eye, then nodded with satisfaction. The dark blue fabric fit him perfectly, and he had to admit he looked more respectable than he had in years. She had also mended all of Little Bird's dresses and made herself a new one from fabric she had been saving, a deep burgundy color that made her look dignified and beautiful. On the evening before the Whitmores were set to arrive, the 3 of them sat around the table for dinner. Nobody ate much. The nervousness was too strong. Little Bird pushed beans around on her plate while Ayana kept getting up to check things that did not need checking. Jack found himself reviewing their story in his mind again and again, making sure he had every detail memorized. "What if they ask me something and I do not know the answer?" Ayana suddenly asked, voicing the fear they all felt. "Then you tell them the truth about whatever they are asking, as much as you can," Jack said. "The only lie is about us being married. Everything else, your life, your work, how you care for Little Bird, all of that is true. Hold on to that truth." That night, Jack lay on his blankets near the stove, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the cabin settling around him. He heard Ayana moving quietly in the bed across the room, unable to sleep. Little Bird's soft breathing was the only peaceful sound in the darkness. "Jack," Ayana's whisper cut through the quiet. "Are you awake?" "Yes," he whispered back. "I want to thank you again. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that what you are doing, it means everything to me. Most men would not help a stranger this way. Most white men would not help an Indian woman at all." Jack was quiet for a moment before responding. "I am not doing this because I am some kind of hero. I am doing it because it is right, and because you and Little Bird have given me something I did not know I needed." "What is that?" Ayana asked softly. "A reason to care again," Jack admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "For 3 years I have just been drifting, not letting myself get close to anyone. But you too. You have reminded me what it feels like to be part of something, to matter to someone. So really I should be thanking you." There was a long silence, and Jack wondered if he had said too much. Then he heard Ayana's voice, thick with emotion. "Sleep well, Jack Morrison. Tomorrow we face this together." The next day dawned gray and cold, with clouds hanging low over the mountains. Jack was up before the sun, building up the fire and making coffee. When Ayana and Little Bird woke, they all went through their morning routine with unusual quietness, each lost in their own worried thoughts. The stagecoach was due to arrive at noon. At 11:30, Ayanna dressed Little Bird in her best dress and braided her hair with extra care, weaving in a small blue ribbon. She changed into her new burgundy dress and asked Jack to help her with the buttons along the back. His fingers fumbled slightly with the task, both of them very aware of how intimate the gesture felt. "You look beautiful," Jack said when he finished, and he meant it. Ayanna had always been pretty, but today she looked strong and dignified, every inch a woman who could hold her own against anyone. "And you look like a proper husband," Ayanna replied, adjusting his collar. "Thank you for wearing David's shirt. I think he would approve of you wearing it." At 11:45, they heard the sound of the stagecoach arriving in town. Jack took a deep breath. "Are we ready?" "As ready as we will ever be," Ayanna said, taking Little Bird's hand on one side and reaching for Jack's on the other. They stood there for a moment, the three of them connected, drawing strength from each other. 20 minutes later, there was a sharp knock at the door. Jack squeezed Ayanna's hand once more, then let go and went to answer it. He pulled open the door to find a tall, stern-looking man in an expensive suit and a woman in elaborate traveling clothes standing on the porch. Behind them stood a younger man carrying their luggage. "I am Thomas Whitmore," the man said, his voice cold and formal. "This is my wife, Margaret. I assume you are the man claiming to be married to my late brother's widow?" Jack felt his temper flare at the dismissive tone but kept his voice calm and respectful. "Jack Morrison, sir. And I am not claiming to be married to Ayanna. I am married to her. There is a difference." He stepped back and opened the door wider. "Please, come in out of the cold." Thomas and Margaret entered the cabin, their eyes immediately scanning everything with critical gazes. Margaret's lip curled slightly as she took in the simple furnishings, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, the colorful native blankets on the walls. Little Bird stood close to her mother, suddenly shy in front of these imposing strangers. "Uncle Thomas, Aunt Margaret," Ayanna said, her voice steady despite Jack knowing how nervous she must feel. "Welcome. This is my husband, Jack, and you remember Little Bird." "How could I forget my own niece?" Thomas said, though his tone suggested he had very little connection to the child. He walked further into the cabin, his hands clasped behind his back. "Though I must say, I hardly recognize her. She has grown." "Children do that," Jack said, perhaps a bit too sharply. Ayanna shot him a warning look, and he took a breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Margaret had moved directly to Little Bird, bending down with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Hello, child. Do you remember us? We came to your house once when you were very small." Little Bird shook her head shyly, pressing closer to Ayanna. "No, ma'am." "Well, we are your family," Margaret continued. "Your father was my dear brother-in-law. We have traveled a very long way to see how you are doing." She looked up at Ayanna with barely concealed coldness. "We were quite surprised to receive word that you had remarried. You did not mention this in any of your letters." "It happened quickly," Ayanna explained, her hand moving to rest on Little Bird's shoulder. "Jack came to town 6 months ago. We met, we talked, and we found comfort in each other. Both of us had lost spouses. Both of us were lonely. It seemed right." Thomas turned to face Jack fully for the first time. "What exactly do you do for work, Mr. Morrison? How do you support this family?" "I work at the Patterson Ranch, about 5 miles west of town," Jack answered. "I handle their horses, help with the cattle, general ranch work. It is honest work and it pays well enough. Combined with what Ayanna earns from her sewing, we do just fine." "Her sewing," Margaret repeated, making it sound like something shameful. "Yes, I suppose that is work of a sort." She walked around the cabin, running her finger along surfaces as if checking for dust. "This cabin is quite small for 3 people. Where does the child sleep?" "In the bed with me," Ayanna said. "Jack sleeps by the stove. The bed is not large enough for all 3 of us." Margaret and Thomas exchanged a look that Jack could not quite read, but it made his skin prickle with warning. There was something calculating in their expressions. "I see," Thomas said slowly. "And tell me, Mr. Morrison, what was my brother's middle name?" The question came out of nowhere, clearly designed to catch Jack off guard. His mind went blank for a moment. Ayanna had told him so many things about David, but had she mentioned his middle name? He could not remember. The silence stretched too long, and he saw suspicion growing in Thomas's eyes. "James," Little Bird suddenly piped up, her small voice filling the cabin. "Papa David's middle name was James. Mama told me it was the same as Grandpa Whitmore's name, the grandpa I never met." Thomas looked down at his niece in surprise, and Jack silently blessed the little girl for her quick thinking. "That is correct," Thomas said slowly. "You remember that?" Mama tells me stories about Papa David all the time, Little Bird said, and there was no lie in her words. She says I should know about him even though he is gone. She says he was brave and kind and that he loved us very much. For just a moment, something softened in Thomas's face. Jack saw a flicker of real emotion, perhaps grief for the brother he had lost. But then Margaret spoke, and the moment passed. How very touching, she said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. Still, stories are not the same as proper education. Tell me, child, can you read? Yes, ma'am, Little Bird said quietly. Mama teaches me. And I go to the school in town twice a week. Twice a week, Margaret repeated with a disapproving shake of her head. In Boston, children attend school 5 days a week. They learn proper subjects from trained teachers. They have libraries and museums and culture. She has love, Jack said, unable to keep quiet any longer. She has a mother who works hard to provide for her, who teaches her both book learning and life skills. She knows her Crow heritage, and she knows her father's heritage, too. That is more than most children get. Love does not put food on the table, Thomas said sharply. Love does not guarantee a future. Margaret and I can provide Little Bird with opportunities she could never have here. A proper education, a proper home, connections to society that will help her make a good marriage one day. She is 8 years old, Ayanna said, her voice rising slightly with anger. She does not need to worry about marriage. She needs to be a child, to be with her mother, to be loved and safe. And is she safe here? Margaret challenged, living on the edge of town, with winters that can kill, with her mother having to work every day just to survive. What happens if you get sick, Ayanna? What happens if your husband loses his job? What happens to Little Bird then? The questions hit like physical blows, each one designed to highlight every fear and vulnerability. Jack saw Ayanna struggling to find answers, saw the doubt and pain in her eyes. He stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of both Ayanna and Little Bird. What happens is that we survive together, like families do, he said firmly. Life is hard everywhere, not just here. But Little Bird is not unloved or uncared for. Look at her. Does she look neglected? Does she look unhappy? Thomas studied Little Bird carefully, and Jack held his breath. The little girl stood straight, clean, and neat in her carefully mended dress, her eyes bright with intelligence despite her shyness. She was the picture of a well-cared-for child. Appearances can be deceiving, Margaret said coldly. We will be staying at the boarding house in town for 1 week. During that time, we will be observing the situation closely. We will see how this household truly functions. And at the end of the week, we will make our decision about what is best for Little Bird's future. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Jack felt Ayanna trembling beside him and reached out to take her hand, squeezing it in what he hoped was a reassuring gesture. They had survived the first encounter, but the real test was just beginning. The next 7 days would determine whether Little Bird stayed with her mother or was taken away to a life among strangers. As Thomas and Margaret prepared to leave for the boarding house, promising to return for dinner the next evening, Jack realized with sinking certainty that this was going to be even harder than he had imagined. These were not reasonable people looking out for a child's welfare. These were people with their own agenda, their own prejudices, and beliefs about how the world should work. And standing against them was going to take every bit of strength and courage that he, Ayanna, and Little Bird could muster. After Thomas and Margaret left for the boarding house, the small cabin felt heavy with tension. Ayanna sat down at the table, her face pale and her hands shaking. Little Bird climbed into her mother's lap, wrapping her small arms around Ayanna's neck. Jack stood by the window, watching the Whitmores disappear down the snowy street, his jaw clenched tight with anger and frustration. "They have already decided," Ayanna said quietly, her voice hollow. "Did you see how Margaret looked at everything? How she spoke to Little Bird? They came here already believing we are not good enough. Nothing we do will change their minds." Jack turned from the window and came to sit beside them at the table. "We cannot give up before we have even tried. Yes, they are difficult people. Yes, they have their own ideas about how things should be, but we have truth on our side. Little Bird is happy and healthy and loved. That has to count for something." "Does it?" Ayanna asked, and Jack heard the despair in her voice. "I am Crow. You are a ranch hand we are pretending is my husband. They are rich white people from the city. Who do you think a judge would believe if this goes to court?" The question hung in the air because they all knew the answer. Jack reached out and placed his hand over Ayanna's. "Then we make sure it never gets to a judge. We show them such a strong, loving family that they have no choice but to leave Little Bird with you." Little Bird pulled back to look at her mother's face. "Mama, do not be sad." I was good today, was I not? I remembered Papa David's middle name. I answered Aunt Margaret's questions properly. Ayanna hugged her daughter tightly, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. You were perfect, my little bird. So brave and smart. I am so proud of you. That night, none of them slept well. Jack lay on his blankets listening to Ayanna toss and turn in the bed across the room. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made him tense, as if Thomas and Margaret might return at any moment to snatch little bird away. The next day brought more challenges. Thomas and Margaret arrived for dinner in the early evening, and Margaret immediately began inspecting everything. She looked through Ayanna's sewing supplies, examined the food in the cupboard, even checked the bed linens. Her face showed disapproval at every turn, finding fault in things that had no fault. You keep a clean home, I will give you that, Margaret said as they sat down to eat the meal Ayanna had spent all afternoon preparing. Though these dishes are quite simple, in Boston we have proper china, passed down through generations. We have what we need, Jack said, his patience already wearing thin. Not everyone measures worth by fancy dishes. Thomas shot him a sharp look. A man's circumstances often reflect his character and his ambition. David had opportunities waiting for him back east. He could have been a professor at a fine university. Instead, he chose to come out here and live in poverty. He chose to follow his heart and his principles, Ayanna said quietly, but with steel in her voice. He believed in justice and peace. He helped many people, both white and crow. That was worth more to him than money or status. And look where it got him, Margaret said coldly. Dead at 32, leaving behind a widow and child with almost nothing. The cruelty of the words made Little Bird gasp softly. Jack saw tears forming in the child's eyes and felt his temper snap. He stood up from the table abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. That is enough, he said, his voice hard as iron. You came here saying you wanted to see how Little Bird is being cared for, but all you have done is insult this home, insult Ayanna's hard work, and now you speak ill of your own brother right in front of his daughter. What kind of people are you? Thomas stood as well, his face flushing red with anger. How dare you speak to us that way? We are trying to save this child from a life of hardship and shame. Shame? Jack repeated, his voice rising. The only shame I see here is how you treat your own family. You look at Little Bird like she is something broken that needs fixing. But she is a beautiful, smart, happy child who knows she is loved every single day. Can your fancy Boston daughters say the same? You know nothing about our daughters, Margaret said icily, also rising from her seat. And you know nothing about what is best for Little Bird. She is half white, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. She deserves to grow up in civilization, not out here in the wilderness with savages. The word hung in the air like poison. Ayanna's face went very still, and Jack saw Little Bird shrink back in her chair, suddenly understanding the depth of hatred behind that single word. In that moment, Jack knew with absolute certainty what kind of people the Whitmores truly were. Get out, Jack said quietly, but with such force that both Thomas and Margaret took a step back. Get out of this house right now. Gladly, Thomas said, grabbing his coat. We have seen enough. This situation is exactly as poor as we feared. We will be contacting our lawyer first thing in the morning to begin proceedings to remove Little Bird from this unsuitable environment. On what grounds? Jack challenged. That her mother loves her, that she is being fed and clothed and educated, that she has a home and family who would do anything for her, on the grounds that she is living with a woman of questionable morals who has married a drifter less than 3 years after her husband died, Thomas shot back. On the grounds that this cabin is barely adequate shelter, on the grounds that Little Bird deserves better than this. Margaret added her own venom as she pulled on her gloves. We also have serious doubts about the legitimacy of your marriage. Something about it does not feel right. If we discover you have been deceiving us, that will only strengthen our case. They swept out of the cabin, slamming the door behind them. The moment they were gone, Ayanna collapsed back into her chair, all the strength seeming to drain out of her. Little Bird immediately climbed into her mother's lap, both of them crying now. Jack stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists, feeling helpless and furious all at once. I am sorry, he finally said. I should not have lost my temper. I should have stayed calm. No, Ayanna said, looking up at him with red eyes. You defended us. You stood up to them when they showed their true nature. But Jack, they are going to take her. They will find a judge who agrees with them, and they will take my baby away. Jack knelt down beside Ayanna's chair, looking at both her and Little Bird. Listen to me. Both of you listen. We are not going to let that happen. There has to be a way to fight this. How? Ayanna asked desperately. You heard Margaret. She suspects we are not really married. If she finds proof, If anyone in town tells her the truth, then everything falls apart. And even if she does not find proof, she will still convince a judge that I am not fit to raise little bird alone." "But you are not alone," Jack said, and as he spoke the words, he realized something important. "Ayanna, what if we made this real? What if we actually got married, not just pretend?" Ayanna stared at him in shock. "What are you saying?" Jack took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I am saying that these past 2 weeks, living here with you and Little Bird, it has meant something to me. You have both come to matter to me more than I ever expected. I know we started this as an arrangement, as a way to fool the Whitmores, but somewhere along the way it stopped feeling like pretending." "Jack, you do not have to do this," Ayanna said, even as hope flickered in her eyes. "You do not have to tie yourself to us out of pity or obligation." "It is not pity," Jack insisted. "And yes, I feel obligated, but not in the way you think. I feel obligated the way a man feels obligated to protect people he cares about, the way a man feels obligated to stand up for what is right." He reached out and gently touched Little Bird's tear-stained cheek. "I lost my wife 3 years ago. I thought I would never want a family again. But you two have shown me I was wrong. If you will have me, truly have me, I want to be part of this family for real." Little Bird looked at her mother with wide, hopeful eyes. "Mama, can Jack really be my papa? Not just pretend, but real?" Ayanna was crying again, but this time the tears seemed different. She looked at Jack for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of doubt or deception. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she slowly nodded. "Are you certain?" she whispered. "This is not a small thing you are offering. Marriage is forever, or it should be." "I am certain," Jack said firmly, "more certain than I have been about anything in a long time." They sat there in the quiet cabin, the three of them forming a circle of connection and hope in the midst of their troubles. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the world in white. The next morning, Jack went into town early and spoke with Reverend Patterson, the kindly old minister who ran the small church. He explained the situation, leaving out the part about their marriage previously being fake, but emphasizing the urgency. The Reverend, who had known Ayanna since she first came to Cedar Ridge with David, agreed to perform the ceremony that very afternoon. When Jack returned to the cabin with the news, Ayanna was finishing a new dress, this one cream-colored with delicate blue beadwork. "If I am going to marry again, I will do it properly," she said, her fingers working quickly with needle and thread. Little Bird danced around the cabin with excitement, the fear of the previous night temporarily forgotten in the joy of this new development. "I am going to have a real papa again," she kept saying, hugging Jack every few minutes. At 2:00 that afternoon, they walked to the church. The Reverend was waiting with his wife and the storekeeper, who would serve as witnesses. It was a small ceremony, simple and quiet, but it felt more real and meaningful than any elaborate wedding could have been. When Reverend Patterson asked Jack if he took Ayanna to be his lawfully wedded wife, Jack looked into her dark eyes and said, "I do," with his whole heart. When Ayanna said the same, her voice was strong and clear, no longer trembling with fear or doubt. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend said with a gentle smile. This time, when Jack kissed Ayanna, it was different from their practice kiss. This was a promise, a commitment, a joining of two broken people who had found healing in each other. When they pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. Little Bird rushed forward to hug them both, and the Reverend's wife dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The storekeeper clapped Jack on the back and congratulated them warmly. They had just signed the marriage certificate when the church door burst open. Thomas and Margaret stood in the doorway, their faces twisted with shock and anger. Behind them stood a stern-looking man in a black suit carrying a leather briefcase. "What is the meaning of this?" Thomas demanded, striding into the church. Reverend Patterson stepped forward calmly. "I have just performed the marriage ceremony for Jack Morrison and Ayanna Whitmore. They are now legally husband and wife, before God and the law." "Impossible," Margaret sputtered. "They told us they were already married 6 months ago. This proves they were lying all along." Jack stepped forward, putting himself between the Whitmores and his new family. "You are right. We were not married before, but we are married now. Legally, officially, and truly. Which means Little Bird has 2 parents who love her and will fight for her with everything they have." The stern man in the black suit, whom Jack assumed was the lawyer Thomas had mentioned, spoke up for the first time. "A marriage performed under false pretenses to avoid legal custody proceedings can be challenged in court." "There are no false pretenses," Jack said firmly. "I married Ayanna because I love her and her daughter, because I want to build a life with them. The timing might be convenient, but the feelings are real." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue more, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way Jack stood protectively in front of his new wife and daughter. Perhaps it was the signed marriage certificate the Reverend held. Perhaps it was something else entirely. His face went through a series of expressions, anger giving way to confusion, then to something that might have been doubt. Margaret had no such doubts. "This changes nothing," she hissed. "We will still take this to court. We will prove that this marriage is a sham designed solely to keep Little Bird away from her rightful family. Her rightful family is standing right here," Ayanna said, finding her voice. She stepped up beside Jack, taking his hand. "I am her mother. Jack is now her father. We are her family. And we will not let you take her away based on nothing more than prejudice and pride." The confrontation might have escalated further, but Reverend Patterson intervened. "Perhaps this discussion should continue elsewhere. This is a house of worship, not a courtroom." He looked at Thomas with gentle but firm eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, I knew your brother David well. He was a good man who loved his wife and daughter deeply. Before you take any more steps, I encourage you to think about what he would want for Little Bird. Would he want her torn from her mother and sent to live with relatives who barely know her? Or would he want her raised with love in the home he built by people who cherish her?" The Reverend's words seemed to pierce through the anger and tension filling the small church. Thomas stood very still, his face unreadable as he stared at the floor. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but her husband held up his hand to stop her. For a long moment, no one moved or said anything. The only sound was the soft whisper of wind against the church windows, and Little Bird's quiet breathing as she pressed close to her mother. Finally, Thomas looked up, and Jack saw something in his eyes he had not seen before. It was pain, raw and deep, the kind of pain that came from loss that had never properly healed. Thomas walked slowly toward them, and Jack tensed, ready to protect his family if needed. But when Thomas stopped, he was not looking at Jack or Ayanna. He was looking at Little Bird. "You look so much like him," Thomas said softly, his voice cracking slightly. "Like David when he was young. The same eyes, the same serious expression when you were thinking hard about something." He cleared his throat, clearly fighting emotion. "I lost my brother 3 years ago. My younger brother, who I was supposed to protect and guide. We argued before he came west. Terrible words were said. I told him he was throwing his life away, that he was being foolish and naive. He told me I was cold and heartless, that I cared more about money and status than about people." Thomas paused, and Jack saw tears forming in the older man's eyes. "We never reconciled. He died before I could tell him I was sorry, before I could tell him that even though I disagreed with his choices, I still loved him, and now all I have left of him is you, Little Bird. His daughter, my niece." Margaret made a small sound of protest, but Thomas continued as if she had not spoken. "When we heard that Ayanna had remarried so quickly, I convinced myself it proved she had never really loved David. I thought she was being careless with his memory, with his daughter. I thought I was protecting you, protecting David's legacy, but I see now that I was wrong." He looked at Ayanna directly for the first time since entering the church. "I watched you yesterday and today. I saw how you care for Little Bird, how you have kept David's memory alive for her, how you work hard to provide for her. I saw a mother who loves her child deeply. And when I called your people by that terrible word, I saw the same hurt in your eyes that I saw in David's eyes the last time we spoke, when I said cruel things about his choices." Thomas turned to face his wife. "Margaret, we need to go outside and talk. Now." Margaret looked furious, her face red and her lips pressed into a thin line, but she followed her husband out of the church without another word. The lawyer, looking uncertain and uncomfortable, followed them as well. The church door closed behind them, leaving Jack, Ayanna, Little Bird, and the Reverend and his witnesses in heavy silence. "What just happened?" Ayanna whispered, afraid to hope. "I think," Reverend Patterson said gently, "that man just realized he has been running from his grief by trying to control what he could not control when his brother was alive. Sometimes it takes seeing our own ugliness reflected back at us to make us wake up." They waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. Little Bird sat in one of the church pews, swinging her legs nervously. Jack stood with his arm around Ayanna's shoulders, both of them prepared for the worst. When the church door finally opened again, Thomas entered alone. His eyes were red and he looked older somehow, as if a great weight pressed down on him. "My wife has returned to the boarding house," he said quietly. "She is very angry with me right now, but she will come around eventually, or she will not. Either way, I have made my decision." He walked closer, his steps slow and deliberate. "I am not going to pursue custody of Little Bird. Ayanna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jack felt his knees go weak with relief. Little Bird jumped up from the pew and ran to her mother, who swept her up into her arms, holding her tight. Thomas continued, his voice thick with emotion. Reverend Patterson is right. David would not want his daughter taken from her mother. He married you because he loved you, Ayanna. He chose this life because he believed in it. Who am I to say he was wrong? Who am I to destroy what he built just because I am too proud to admit that my brother might have been wiser than me? Thank you, Ayanna managed to say through her tears. Thank you so much. There is more, Thomas said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. David had a trust fund, money our father left him. I've been managing it since his death. I convinced myself that the money should be saved until Little Bird was grown, that you would waste it or use it improperly, but that was wrong of me. This money belongs to Little Bird, and by extension, to you as her mother and guardian. There is enough here to help with her education, to improve your circumstances, to give you some security. He held out the envelope, and after a moment's hesitation, Ayanna took it with her free hand, still holding Little Bird with the other. I do not know what to say. Say that you will let me know how she's doing from time to time, Thomas said, and now the tears did fall down his cheeks. Say that you will tell her about her father, about the Whitmore family, about where she comes from. Say that, maybe, someday when she is older she might want to visit Boston and meet her cousins. Not to live there, but just to know that part of her heritage too. I promise, Ayanna said firmly. Little Bird should know all of who she is. Crow and White, her mother's people and her father's, she should know that her Uncle Thomas loved her father and loves her too, even if he showed it in a confused way. Thomas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He stepped forward and gently touched Little Bird's cheek, the same way a grandfather might touch a beloved grandchild. You are so precious, little one, so very precious. Your father would be so proud of the person you are becoming. Little Bird, with the remarkable forgiveness that children possess, reached out and hugged her uncle. Thomas held her for just a moment, then pulled back, clearly overwhelmed with emotion. He looked at Jack, and the two men's eyes met. Take care of them, Thomas said simply. Be the husband and father they deserve. Be better than I was as a brother. I will, Jack promised. You have my word. Thomas nodded once more, then turned and walked out of the church. They heard his footsteps crunching in the snow outside, growing fainter and then disappearing entirely. The Reverend's wife was crying openly now, and even the storekeeper had to wipe his eyes. Well, Reverend Patterson said with a warm smile, that was quite an eventful wedding ceremony. Shall we proceed to the celebration? My wife made a cake. The tension broke and everyone laughed, the sound full of relief and joy and disbelief that everything had somehow turned out right. They followed the Reverend and his wife to their home next to the church, where indeed a simple but beautiful cake waited. They ate and talked and celebrated not just a marriage, but the preservation of a family and the triumph of love over prejudice. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered town in shades of orange and pink, Jack and Ayanna walked home with Little Bird between them, each parent holding one of her hands. The little girl skipped and jumped, happy and secure, no longer afraid of being taken away from everything she knew and loved. That night, after Little Bird had fallen asleep in the big bed, Jack and Ayanna sat together by the fire. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, more complete. Jack held Ayanna's hand, marveling at how much his life had changed in just 2 weeks. I never expected this, Ayanna said softly. When I asked you to pretend to be my husband, I never imagined it would become real. I never imagined I could feel this way about someone again. Neither did I, Jack admitted. After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I would just drift forever, alone. But then you and Little Bird came into my life and reminded me that there can be second chances, that hearts can heal if we let them. Ayanna leaned her head against his shoulder. What happens now? We have fought so hard just to get to this moment. What do we do with this new life we have been given? Jack thought about the question. He thought about the envelope Thomas had left, which they had opened to find it contained more money than either of them had seen in their lives. He thought about the ranch where he worked, and how the owner had mentioned wanting to retire and might be willing to sell the place to the right buyer. He thought about Little Bird and the future she could have now, with education and opportunity, and most importantly, love. Now, he said slowly, we build something, not just for ourselves, but for Little Bird and maybe for other children someday, if we are blessed. We take this cabin that David built and this life that you have fought to preserve, and we make it into something even better. We show everyone that love matters more than money or status or what people think. We prove that families come in all different forms, and every one of them is valuable. Ayanna lifted her head to look at him, her dark eyes shining in the firelight. You know, when David first told me he wanted to marry me, I was afraid. I knew how hard it would be, how much prejudice we would face. But he told me that anything worth having was worth fighting for. I see that same strength in you, Jack Morrison. That same belief that doing right is more important than doing what is easy. Your David sounds like he was a remarkable man, Jack said. I hope I can live up to his example. You already have, Ayanna assured him. You stood up to Thomas and Margaret when it would have been easier to walk away. You defended us when others would have stayed silent. You chose us, Jack. Not because you had to, but because you wanted to. That means everything. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the world was quiet and peaceful, the snow muffling all sound. Inside the cabin, 3 people who had been broken by loss had found each other and become whole again. Over the next few months, life in the small cabin settled into a comfortable rhythm. Jack continued working at the ranch, but now he came home each evening to a real family, to a wife who greeted him with a smile and a daughter who ran to hug him. Ayanna's sewing business grew as word spread of her skill, and she began teaching Little Bird the craft as well. They received occasional letters from Thomas, who had returned to Boston but seemed changed by his experience in Cedar Ridge. He wrote about his own daughters and grandchildren, about the work he was doing to support schools that helped immigrant children. He never mentioned Margaret in his letters, and they suspected the couple's marriage had been strained by Thomas's decision to leave Little Bird with Ayanna. But Thomas seemed at peace with his choice, and he always asked for news about his niece. True to his word, Thomas also arranged for the trust fund money to be transferred properly. Jack and Ayanna used some of it to buy the ranch where Jack worked, giving them security and a real future. They kept the cabin too, though, because it held memories and meaning that no amount of money could replace. Little Bird thrived in the years that followed. She grew into a confident young woman who knew both sides of her heritage and was proud of both. She attended school regularly, excelling in her studies, but she also learned traditional Crow skills from her mother and practical ranching knowledge from Jack. She became a bridge between worlds, just as her father David had been. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Jack and Ayanna stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. Little Bird, now 13 years old, was inside preparing dinner, singing softly to herself as she worked. "Do you ever regret it?" Ayanna asked suddenly. "Agreeing to help a desperate stranger? Giving up your freedom to be tied down to a ready-made family?" Jack pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Not for a single moment. You and Little Bird gave me back my life. You gave me a reason to stop running and start living again. If anything, I should be asking if you regret taking a chance on a lonely cowboy who stumbled into your general store." Ayanna smiled up at him. That lonely cowboy turned out to be the answer to my prayers, even though I did not know it at the time.
"You saved us, Jack."
What more could any woman want? From inside the cabin came Little Bird's voice calling them to dinner. They went inside together, hand in hand, to the warm glow of lamplight and the smell of good food and the sound of their daughter's laughter. They sat around the same simple table where they had once nervously rehearsed their fake marriage story, but now they shared real stories, real love, real life. Jack looked around at his family, at the home they had built together, at the second chance they had all been given. He thought about that cold winter day when a desperate woman had begged him to pretend to be her husband for 1 week. He thought about how that one decision, that one act of kindness, had changed everything. Sometimes, he realized, the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes love finds you when you are not looking for it. Sometimes families are not born but chosen. And sometimes, just sometimes, what starts as pretend can become the most real and true thing you have ever known. As they ate dinner together that evening, laughing and talking and simply enjoying each other's company, Jack sent up a silent prayer of thanks. Thanks for the winter storm that brought him to Cedar Ridge. Thanks for a brave woman who took a chance on a stranger. Thanks for a little girl who taught him how to love again. And thanks for second chances, for new beginnings, and for the unexpected miracles that can happen when lonely souls find each other in the wilderness and decide to build something beautiful together. The cabin that David built, the home that Ayanna preserved, and the family that Jack joined had become something greater than any of them alone. It had become a testament to the power of love, courage, and the simple human desire to protect and care for one another. And, in the end, that was all that truly mattered.